Thank you so much, June. It's very good to be here. Thanks for having me here. So as June said, my name is Dee Coakley. I'm the CEO of Boundless. So just to give you a little bit of background on myself, Boundless is a company HQ'd in Ireland. It's a remote employment platform, and we allow companies to compliantly employ people internationally. We support employment across many different European countries, some in Asia, and we're just about to launch for North America. And we're adding new countries all the time. To give you a little bit of background on myself, as June mentioned, I spent 10 years in COO roles at software companies. And it was through that I encountered the challenges of employing people and managing payroll across multiple countries. And that's given me insights into how all of this works for companies that are looking at companies internationally, looking at perhaps employing people or having workers work with them that are based somewhere like the Philippines. And our company, Boundless, we act as an employer of record on behalf of our customers. Our customers are companies with international remote teams, as June mentioned, and we take care of all of the admin and compliance headaches of international employment, payroll, tax, HR. And this means that companies can get set up to fully employ someone in a new country in minutes, where it would usually take them months if they weren't working with a company like Boundless. So I'm going to have a chat with you about employee and contractor classification. So as people interested in remote work, you might be wondering what kind of rights you might be entitled to if you're working for a company that's based and controlled overseas in another country. And if you're a leader in a company that has an internationally distributed team, then you might be considering what your options are for how you engage or employ those workers that might be based in countries outside the Philippines if you're employing them or managing them from the Philippines. So I'm going to give you an overview of how employment compares with contracting when it comes to international remote work. So some of you might not be aware that when you look for remote work, if you're an individual looking for remote work, there are two different ways that you could be engaged by the companies that you might work for, either as an employee or as a contractor. And in the Philippines for years, many people have been doing remote work for companies overseas as contractors. And a lot of that's down to some regulations in the Philippines that make it very easy for people to work on fixed term contracts as contractors for international companies. But many companies are now employing people as employees and giving them all of those rights. And a lot of the top tech companies in the US that offer really great opportunities are offering full employment right now with all of the benefits that go with that to workers in the Philippines. So let's look at the differences between a worker being designated as an employee or a contractor. And this does vary country to country. So I'm giving broad brush strokes here for those of you that might also be looking at employing people or engaging workers in other countries. So if someone's an employee, they are actually employed by the company that they work for. It's a legal designation, a worker classification. They'll be signed up to a full-time employment agreement. They'll be paid through the company's payroll. That company that they work for will handle all of their tax affairs. There'll be an ongoing commitment. Usually the intention, if a company and a worker sign up to an employment agreement, usually the intention is that this will be a long-term arrangement. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's usually why people would use employment. And those workers that are employed through a full employment agreement and are designated as an employee are protected by local employment laws. That they get strong protection through that. If an individual works as a contractor for a company, they will be self-employed. The type of agreement, the type of contract that they'll work under with that company is a client services agreement. That individual will need to invoice their clients. Generally, there isn't a long-term commitment. In most countries, for someone to be appropriately classified as a contractor, there should not be a long-term commitment. And if there is a long-term commitment, there can be issues with misclassification. And then that individual, because they are essentially an entity working for themselves, they are self-employed, they have no or very limited protection from employment regulations. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point that I am not an expert at all in Filipino employment regulations. I only have a very high level understanding of the regulations in the Philippines. But the Philippines does have some worker classification regulations that we don't see in many other countries. For Filipino workers working for companies based in the Philippines, a project or casual worker will actually be classified as an employee. It's a certain type of designation, but there are special exemptions from that for offshore companies engaging contractors in the Philippines. So if you were based in the Philippines and you were working for a company based elsewhere, there is a special designation. I'll talk more about that in a moment. So when I talk you through each of these things, I look at everything from a company perspective and from a worker perspective. I know we have both in the audience. So when we look at contracting and where contracting is really great, and contracting works really well for both parties in certain scenarios. So first of all, it gives great flexibility to the company. They're not tied into anything long-term, which means they have the ability to control their spend. So depending on how the company is budgeting or what their plans are for the future, that can be really beneficial. Contracting eliminates the employer tax expense. So the company is not contributing to employer taxes on behalf of the individual, which from a company perspective can be helpful. There is a reduction of risk where employment rights don't apply. However, big caveat, the company must be sure that they are complying with the regulations of the country the individuals are based in. If you are a Filipino company and you're having people work for you in other countries, contractor classification regulations are different in every country. In a country like Portugal, for example, the regulations are very different to the Philippines. If someone's working for you long-term and they're very committed to your company, you will probably have to classify them as an employee. But there may be a reduction of risk if the individual is genuinely a contractor. And where a company doesn't have a long-term commitment, it means they can source the best fit talent for each individual project. From a worker perspective, they also get flexibility. They don't have to make a long-term commitment. They can work for multiple clients simultaneously. Potentially, they can earn more due to the lower cost for the company. You know, it depends on if the company is looking to absorb that cost saving themselves. And from the contractor, the individual's perspective, the company won't actually be handling all payroll and tax affairs. The individual will have to, if the individual is working as a contractor, they'll have to handle their own payroll and tax affairs. So the downside then to contracting, from a company perspective, there's limited loyalty. You might find that you've increased turnover of your team members, which can be a real problem. And that can be caused by the fact that you end up with a culture challenge. A lot of the prospective customers and companies that we work with, that we talk with, they have an issue where the fully compliant employees in their companies feel really valued and really feel like the core team. And the contractors feel like they're in some kind of second tier. So a lot of the companies that we work with are looking to address that problem. And all of that affects your recruitment brand. So it may be more difficult to hire people who are looking for compliant employment. And the risk of worker misclassification, if as a company you don't correctly classify people, there is a real risk of being fined by the government in whatever country those people are based in. And then some companies feel there are ethical issues around not providing security to their team. From a worker perspective, there's a real lack of stability. There's no protection from local employment regulations. Potentially, there's reduced access to benefits. Depends on how the company has those set up, but many companies will just offer full benefits to employees. The individual would need to engage an accountant. And that's because they have to manage their own tax filings and statutory returns. So there is a bit of a admin work there. So I mentioned earlier that the Philippines has some specific laws around this. Under Filipino law, an offshore company can hire an independent contractor to perform a specific job. A valid contract, the contract needs to be compliant. It won't establish an employer-employee relationship for the company so long as the contract doesn't exceed a maximum period. And that can be really beneficial for companies. And a lot of companies have people working for them in the Philippines on that basis. But the big risk for the companies is that there's no clear test. In some other countries, it's very clear how you classify a worker. And that lack of certainty does create a risk for companies. So we've talked about contracting. Let's look for a moment at employment. So what are the benefits of employment? Why would anyone choose to do this? So from the company perspective, it's a talent acquisition tool. We talked about employer brand, being able to say to individuals that a company will offer full employment, the same as everyone else on their team, is really attractive for a lot of workers. It also then means that those companies have higher retention rates. Once a company is fully employing people under employment agreements and complying with all employment regulations, the company is completely eliminating any risk of worker misclassification. No government has an issue with any company complying with employment regulations and giving full employment rights to an individual. And doing right by the team and appropriately rewarding valued workers is something that can be a real benefit for a company in terms of their employer brand. And for many companies, being ethical and doing the right thing is how they run their businesses, and it's a goal they want to achieve. From a worker perspective, employment means stability and security. It means predictability of income. For many countries, terminating an employee is a much slower process than terminating a contracting agreement. Often a contracting agreement can be terminated with, say, a week's notice. While I'm not familiar with the termination regulations for employees in the Philippines, but many companies will choose to align that with the best in class of their workers based on the countries that they're based in. So quite often it means real stability there in terms of longevity of the relationship. The worker will have full protection of all employment regulations locally. And in the Philippines, workers are entitled to strong protections around holiday pay, time off, and so on. So that's something that many workers will seek out where that opportunity is available. And then as a worker, you'd have access to all of the perks and benefits from the company, and no payroll, tax, and accounting admin. The company that you work for would take care of all of that. So some challenges with employment. From a worker perspective, employment is far more straightforward. There is very little that an individual needs to worry about when it comes to employment, and a number of upsides. From a company's perspective, there are obligations. So the employer will have to ensure that they're supporting cross-border HR compliance. People will be entitled to the employment rights of the country that they are based in. The company, if you have an international remote team, you'll have to take care of multi-country payroll. So people will have to be paid through the country that they are based in. And that payroll will need to be processed in a way that's compliant with the local tax regime. And then, of course, you would have to make payment to the workers in that country, payments to the local tax authorities and to any benefits providers. And then for companies with internationally distributed teams, something that those companies really need to consider is harmonization of compensation and benefits across distributed teams. It's not, it can take some work and effort, but it can usually be very, very worthwhile to put in that work. So for a company that does want to support remote employment, there are two routes that company can go. And the first one is DIY. So that is where a company establishes its own employment infrastructure in the country where those workers are based. So the company will need to get to grips with the local employment terms. You'll probably want to work with a local employment lawyer. You'll need to produce a dual language employment agreement that complies with all those local regulations. You will need to keep up to date with any changes in those regulations and legislation, and make sure you're always offering your workers benefits and rights that are compliant with them. There are very specific rules around employment termination. They vary a lot country to country. In some countries, it can be quite a process. And then there are the payroll processing and tax requirements that I just mentioned. Also, something to bear in mind is the cost of employment in the country. Every country has different rates of taxes, employment taxes, and different costs for the employer. So always worth looking into that and figuring that out before you make an offer to someone in a new country. So that's one way of doing it, is figuring all of that out yourself, working with local lawyers and accountants to take care of all of that. Something to bear in mind is you would have to register with the local tax authority. That can take many months. It can take up to 18 months for some countries. So the alternative to that is working with a PEO, a professional employer organization. So Boundless, my company, is a PEO. We support companies with all of this. So what we do is we have the established infrastructure in each of these countries, and we act as the legal employer on our customers' behalf. So our customers don't need to worry about any of this. We understand the local employment regulations in the countries where those workers are based. And if you're an individual that is talking to companies overseas about potentially working for them, and you're interested in being employed from the Philippines by a company that's based in another country, and they're not sure how to provide you with that compliant employment, you can propose that they look for a PEO, an international professional employer organization, that they could use to then employ you. And we're always happy to talk to companies. My contact details are at the end. You can feel free to take my details and share them with any company that you might be interested in working for. So just a quick recap, we're going to move to questions and answers in a moment, which June will help us with. But if you are seeking work, if you're looking for work, remember that full employment and all of the security and benefits that it brings are a very real possibility with many remote roles and lots of international companies. Perhaps companies that you are already working for may be providing international employment. If you haven't worked for them as an employee before, it may be worth asking if you can convert from a contractor to an employee, or if you're looking for a new job, ask at interview stage. If you're a leader at a company and you're building remote teams, people are your company's greatest asset. It's really worth nurturing a great employer brand by demonstrating to prospective hires that your company offers secure, stable employment. Remote is fantastic. It allows you to recruit, hire, and retain the best people. So if you have never hired internationally remote before, it's really worth opening up your hiring to international remote and taking a look and seeing what you get. And the reason for that is because talent really is distributed. You can open up your recruitment pool to wherever those people are based. It's worth investing in developing that considered employer brand and educating yourself on the local employment regulations wherever people are based. So that's it for me in terms of my talk. I think I'll be joined by June now for our Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Dee. It's very knowledgeable. I hope a lot of the people in the audience learned from this presentation. We have a couple of questions that you would like to bring up. And also just to give you some context, because human talent is actually one of our biggest exports in the Philippines. We have a lot of what we call OFWs, or overseas Filipino workers, right? And what typically happens is that it separates families because one person, the husband or wife probably needs to go international, and then the other actually has a really good and stable job in the Philippines, and they can't go outside because they're unable to be unemployed internationally, right? And this, I think, Boundless is something that they can offer to their employer. It says that, okay, our family needs to move to Australia. This is the closest, migration point of the Philippines here, by the way, or to Singapore. And they would say, we want to go ahead and be employed in Australia, keep my job, but I want to go ahead and be employed through Boundless, for example. Right? How does that process work? Do they contact you and you contact the employee? That's just a question that we had here internally.
Yeah, sure. And we do support employment in both Australia and in Singapore, so we can certainly help with that. The best thing, you'll see my details on the screen there. Take a look at our website. That email address you see there, ask@boundlesshq.com. Any questions can be directed there, and any questions we don't have a chance to get through today can go there. The best thing is to take a look at our website, see how it all works. We have a really detailed FAQ section on there, and then point the company that you work for in the direction of Boundless. So you will see on our website, there is some information for employees, so for individuals, and there is actually a letter there that you can download and share with the company that you work for to explain what it is that Boundless does. Or you can just simply give them the domain address and they can come and visit the website and contact us. Our customer is the company. It's not the individual. We work with the company. So you would need to put them in touch with us. But yeah, we would love to help with those scenarios. And often, you know, the company you work for might not understand this when you suggest it or propose it. They will just say, oh, no, that's too difficult. That's too difficult. But you can share information with them from our website. Our blog posts as well. If you go to the blog on the website, you'll find lots of articles that are really helpful that you can share with the company you work for.
Right. That's really good to know. So basically, if, for example, and not just in the Philippines, I guess, you know, with any company that you would want to work for as an employee, but you are not in the same location, or they don't have a legal entity on the place that you want to move to.
Yes.
That would be.
Yeah. So for example, perhaps you work for a US company at the moment, and they are set up to employ people in the Philippines. So you were employed by them in the Philippines, but they're maybe a US company, and you would like to move to Australia, but that they are not set up to support employment in Australia, then we can help with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, the question was raised because I have a friend who is married to a nomad. And so right now she has been working as a contractor for a company in Singapore, right? And what this does is that she has to always keep going back to the area because she cannot be outside of that the country. You know, in the Philippines, for example, you cannot be outside of the Philippines for a certain amount of time. So to be considered as an employee, you need to be a contractor when that happens, right? And it does complicate things. So I think those are really clear. There's another question here, last one before we wrap things up, I think. Ms. Dee, what is the working culture challenges you encounter in the Philippines? Good question.
It's a really good question. To be clear, we don't currently support employment in the Philippines. We are working on it, so we will be very, very soon. I mean, personally, I don't have experience of challenges. I have worked with Filipino workers in the past. That has been with them working for me as contractors. I haven't had challenges personally. I do think that for a lot of companies, they do have workers working for them as contractors. And because of this designation for overseas companies feel they just don't need to worry about employment rights in the Philippines. And I do have a friend who has a company who got fined for worker misclassification with his Filipino team. So not quite a culture problem, but it's a challenge. You know, I think sometimes companies think there are no problems, that they don't need to consider employment regulations at all, but actually they do, and that's a little bit of a worry for international companies, if they haven't looked into the compliant employment.
Right. Actually, I'm glad that you brought that up, because basically we've kind of gotten accustomed to that idea, you know, that if we are going to be working for an international company, it will only be a contractor. And I think we spoke about this before, we've always been working this way because we didn't know that there was an option like Boundless, right? That we didn't know that we can, when I get hired by an international company, I can, tell them, can you employ me through Boundless or through this company or whatnot, right? And so it's really great that you did this presentation, and a lot of people are aware now that we do have this option, and
it's new. I mean, if you speak to the company that you work for about it, they might not have heard of this. A lot of Americans will have, because Americans use this model to employ people in other states of the US. But if the company you work for is European, the people you talk to might not have heard of this. But the people to talk to are senior people in the HR department or in the finance department.
Right. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you again so much, Dee. Is it possible for us to get a copy of this presentation?
I sent it to you last night.
Oh, right. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's like a line that I say every end of the talk. Can I ask for? Okay. Thank you so much. We will be sharing the slides with everybody. And we are going to be doing the panel discussion right after this. So stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back.